know how to get an input from user with a function. So that way, when your program is being executed, you can ask for an input while it is going through different lines of code. So sometimes you need the stuff in the middle of your program, and then you can easily use input function to get an input while your code is being run. Okay, so we have that. I'm not going to go through these parts yet. There are a couple of things I need to talk about before we can go through the stuff that we have here. The reason behind that is input function, as we discussed, is always going to give you a string type. And with the stuff that we have here, we need to have numbers. We need to have numeric values to be able to apply those arithmetic operators on. But right now, input function gives us a string type. What happens? How can we go from one type to the other type? And that is the thing that we are going to talk about. But before that, I'm going to go back very briefly over some of the arithmetic operators that we discussed before and see which one of them can be applied into string types and how we can go back and forth between different types. All right, so I want to go to the shell. So right now I close my shell, so I'm going to run and open Python shell. So if you, for any reason, you don't need your, you need to close your shell, you can always rerun it through the run tab. Okay, so here, again, with arithmetic operators, you can have different operands of different types if they're numeric values, and have the arithmetic operators. So like, for instance, 2 multiplied by 1, it gives you the result of that. If you have 9.1, for instance, multiplied by 2, 1 is type float, 1 is type integer, it gives you a float type, right? Those are the things that we discussed before. So if you have numeric values, either integer or float, you can apply arithmetic operators into them and get a result based on what operands that you have. When it comes to string types, or when it comes to arithmetic operators, you can only apply them to numeric values. There is 1 or 2 exceptions that we have. They are basically the same thing, but the exception is the plus sign. Plus sign can be applied to any other data type as well. As we go and learn about different data types, we are going to use it and see how plus sign is used for different data types. So with plus sign, what it does is it adds 2 values to each other. When those 2 values are numeric values, it adds them mathematically, and you get the result of what the result of those 2 numbers are when you add them to each other. If you have 2 apples plus you want to add 1 more apple to it, you get 3 apples. When it comes to other data types, for instance, string data type, I have one string and I have another string and I want to add them to each other. It basically, what we call it, it concatenates them. It adds them, it glues them to each other, right? It puts them right next to each other. It's the same concept of adding stuff to each other. If they're numbers, you get the result of the addition in adding numbers to each other. If the stuff that you have are other types, if you're gluing 2 things to each other, you're going to be connected, right? So let's see an example of that. I have this string hello, and I want to glue or concatenate or add this string hello to another string that is word. So if I press enter, the 2 strings are added to each other and become 1 string. So I have hello world as 1 string. And you can add stuff to it. So if you want to see a space between them, you can add the space either here, or you can add a space right here. It's going to show you the result. It's going to glue those strings as they are. However they are, it's going to take them exactly how they come and put them together. So here we go, hello world, glue those 2, concatenated those 2 strings into 1 string. You can have more than 2 if you want to. So I can say hello world, and then just do exclamation. For some reason, you don't want to have it at the end of word. And if you do that, it's going to concatenate 3 strings into 1 string for you. Okay, so that is how concatenation works. So it is basically the same concept of addition, you're adding two strings to each other. That is the exceptions that we have when it comes to arithmetic operators. Addition used for adding stuff in general to each other. Another exception is multiply. So with addition, the two side of the operand, the two side of the operator that we have, the operands that you have, must be the same type. So in this case, you have two strings. When it comes to numeric values, you have numeric values, even though you have like sometimes integer and float, but they're numeric values. So they kind of, when it comes to plus, they count as one type. So, and with any other type, if you want to concatenate the stuff, if you want to add the stuff to each other, the two operands must be exactly the same size. If it's as type, if they're different types, it's not going to work. So here, if you want to add anything to any other value, so if I have this numeric string 3 and I want to concatenate it to numeric string 1, it is going to generate numeric string 31 for me, okay? 3 plus 1 is not going to look at them as numbers because they're not numbers, they're string types. And the result is going to be 31, which is a numeric string, right? Another example of that is, again, with any numbers like 25, and then you have another string, which is a letter, so it's 25A, right? So it could be any string that you have. It doesn't care that much about like what the strings you have. It basically concatenates them, glues them to each other as they are. Okay. Another exception when it comes to operators is multiply. When it comes to multiply, it's the same concept of plus. So if you say 2 multiplied by 3, you're repeating 2 3 times or repeating 3 2 times, right? Same here. So let's say I want to repeat hello 3 times. I'm basically, or 2 times, I'm saying hello plus 2 instead of saying hello plus hello plus hello plus hello. I say hello repeated 4 times. So it is a concept of addition or concatenation, but you're using multiply to simplify it, right? So that is another exception when it comes to operators that you can apply to other data types. The other operands that we have, they're only for numeric value. There are a few that we talk about later on, but for now, just remember plus and multiply that we apply to other data types as well. Okay, now let's go back to our code here. So we have numeric values, we have num1 and num2, and those two values are coming from input functions. So if I print num1 and num2, it's going to show them, it's going to get the input from user 4 and 1, and it's going to show me 4 and 1. So let's try something else here. Let's say num1 plus num2. So if I run this one, instead of 5, I put 4 and 1 again. Instead of 5, it's going to show me 41. The reason is 4 and 1, both are coming through input function. An input function always, no exception, gives you string type. So their type is string. You're doing a string concatenation in this part. You're saying, I have this string numeric string 4. I have numeric string 1. Put them together. So is 41 as type of string. So it's going to give you the result, but the values that you pass to it, they were numbers. They were string types. So it's going to give you a numeric string as a result. Right? So if you see something that is off, it is probably because you had a string type. All right. So, but let's say I wanted a number. I wanted to get a number from user, but I have the input function. It always gives me a string type. How can I go from one type to the other? So that is another function that we are going to talk about, or some other functions that we are going to talk about. The first one is type integer, which comes from the name. It takes a value and converts it to an integer. The other one is a float type that takes a value, converts it to a float, and then a string is taking a value, converts it to a string value. Okay, I'm going to take this one out, so because we are using these ones more often. So we can see them all in one screen. So here we have two different functions that convert a numeric string to a number, integer or float. You can use either one of them to go from one type to the other. So in this case, I have the input, and input gives me a string type, and I want to go to an integer or a float type. And let's see how it is done. Again, we are going to go back to our shell and practice it here, and then we are going to take what we learned into our program. So here, let's just practice with some numbers. So I have this, let's say num, and num has a numeric string 2. All right, so it has a numeric string 2. If I print it, it is numeric string 2. It's a string type, and we see the result. So I want to change this value to an integer type. So to do that, I'm going to use this function. You see it turned purple, and I have the parentheses. So I'm going to pass this value num to this function int. If I do that, it's going to change the type of the variable num into an integer type. Okay? So now here's a question for you. If I type num, am I going to get an integer or a string? Okay, think about it. And then I'm going to press enter and going to see it is going to still be type a string. Why? I did change it to an integer, or did I? So what I did here in this line was, okay, show me the integer version of num. I never did the reassignment. If you do not assign a value to a variable, to a bucket, you're not changing it. My num is still a string 2. Nowhere here I'm saying change num to another value. If I don't do that, it stays the value it was. So it's going to stay string 2. If I want to change it, I can say, okay, I want this num to be the integer version of itself. So it passes a value num, which is a string 2. It converts it to an integer, and then it assigns it to that variable num. And that's okay. Always evaluate the right side of the equation first, or right side of the equal sign first. Do all of the stuff that you have in your expression, and then the result of it is going to be assigned to the variable that you have on the left side. Okay? So it takes the current value of num, which is a string 2, and then it's going to convert that to an integer, becomes number 2, and the number 2 is going to be assigned to this variable num. So if I run this one, say what is num, now it is number 2. Now it is number 2. So now let's practice it with getting an input from user, which generates a string type for you, and then we are going to convert that to an integer. Okay? So if I have my input, enter a number. So we have that. So we put the colon and everything. So we're getting an input from user. I'm going to put 2, or let's do another number, 9. So it's going to be string 9. Again, going back to what I explained when we were talking about input, if you don't store your value, you lose it. You need to store it. Right now, I got an input from user. I don't have any access to it anymore. It is 9. I see it there. But if I want to change it or use it, I have no way to do that because I never stored it. Okay? So I'm going to redo this part. I'm going to store it into a variable. My value is equal to this. And if I do that, it's going to ask for a number. I'm going to put 8. And now if I say value, what is value is going to show me the result. Now I have a way to access that information. I have a bucket that holds my value. So I have 8. Now I want to change it. So I can say, okay, what is the int version of the value? It's going to convert it to 8 to a numeric value. But my value, the variable that I have, is still type string because I never reassigned it. So to do that, I can do this part, not that part. I can do this part and then say, okay, value is equal to the int version of value. Or you can have a different name for it if you want to. If you want to keep the original version as it is, as a string type, you can do that and pick a different name. You can say, okay, value 1 is the int version of value, right? Up to you. At this point, I don't need that original type, so I can reassign it and just keep the number of variables I'm creating as minimum as possible. So if I do that, now value is going to be type integer. Okay? So this is one way of doing it. The other way is directly when you are getting that input from user, you can say, okay, get this input from user, and as soon as you get it, I want you to convert it to an integer. So it first starts from the inner parentheses. Python always starts from the inner parentheses. It gets the input from user. So it's going to, let's say, numeric string 5. It gets that number. So you have a numeric string 5 now, which is like something like this. It replaces that entire thing with that. And then you're converting that integer, that numeric string, to an integer version of it. And then you're putting it inside this variable num. So it's like going to make its way out from the inner parentheses to out. Okay? So it replaces the input that you get and then converts it to an integer, assigns it to value. So let's go ahead and run it. So I have this numeric 5. Or numeric string 5, and then if I say what is value, this time is going to be integer 5. It doesn't have the quotations anymore because as soon as I got the value, I converted it to an integer. It could be a float type if you want to have a float type. Okay, so now let's go back here and try it again. So you can either convert it to numeric value when you get the input. So I can say int or float when you get the value. And I'm going to change this one to float value so you can see both. So the first one is an integer. So you get the input, then convert it to an integer, then put it inside this bucket num1. And then second one, you get an input, convert it to float type, put it inside your bucket num2, and then you're done. So then later on, when you're printing the numbers and then doing the addition, you're working with numbers. So let's go ahead and run it. So what is the first value? 5. What is the second value? 2. And here's what we see. The first value is 5, and that is integer 5. The second value, we converted that to a float type, so it's 2.0 because it's a float type. And then the result is going to be a float type. Okay, so this is one way of converting it to a different type. You can convert it to other types as well if you want to. The other way is, which some people prefer, is you get the input, you get done with it, you're not changing that line in any way. And then in the next line, you're saying, okay, I want to change it now. So I get this num1, convert it to an integer, put it back into this bucket. Right? So you're changing its type and then putting back where it was. And then same thing with num2. You can say num2 equal to a float, and then you have num2 as the result of that. Okay? So same thing is going to do the exact same thing for you. Just looks longer. Up to you which one you want to pick. Both are going to operate exactly the same if I put the same numbers. So and 2 is going to be 5, 2.0. The result is 7.0. I personally prefer the first method, just having it be in the same line when I'm getting my inputs. That way it looks shorter and more concise. But again, it's up to you. Both are equally correct. So now we have that. You can take this line and we can uncomment this entire section and run this code. It should be fine right now because now we are working with numbers, and same as before. Instead of having and hard coding the numbers ourselves, the numbers are coming from your users. So I'm going to run it one more time. So 4 and 200, for instance. So here is the result of that. So you're going to see all of the values and the result of that.